Good day, everybody, and greetings and a very warm welcome. We are going to start our program, which is the CVF Global Parliamentarians meeting. It's being conducted virtually using the Zoom platform, and we are calling it a webinar. And as this is a global meeting, we will have interpretation in French as well as Spanish. I request everyone now to select your language, either English, French, or Spanish. And this is found in the settings of Zoom. Please also mute the original language as you select yours. If you have any issues with selecting the language, please use the chat function that we have. I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom. I think the pandemic has made us quite conversant with using this virtual platform. So please use the chat box to obtain assistance from the Secretariat. They are standing by to render any possible assistance that you may require. So again, a very warm welcome to this first global meeting of parliaments and parliamentarians of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, or CVF, as we call ourselves. I would like to welcome colleagues from CVF parliaments from different parts of the world. My name is Sabir Chowdhury, and I'm speaking to you today from Dhaka, Bangladesh. As you may be aware, Bangladesh is presiding the Climate Vulnerable Forum for the second time, and I'm pleased to be joining you as moderator of today's session, both as chair of the Bangladesh Parliament's Standing Committee on Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and also as the honorary president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. I will begin by making some brief housekeeping statements, because I think these are very important. So I just seek your attention in this regard, because it is important that we get the housekeeping right. I would request all of you to keep your devices on mute unless you're speaking. I think this is very important. We don't want to have any background noise. So please keep all your devices on mute unless you're speaking. We ask all the panelists and speakers to keep their videos on. So please keep the videos on. The entire event, you'll be happy to know, is being live streamed, and you will find the link in the chat box. I've already seen the link is up there, and we encourage you all to share the link and to live tweet and post on this event as we go forward. We have a very compact 90 minutes program that is also limited, as you will appreciate, due to interpretation. So I seek the cooperation of all of the speakers to keep to the indicated times. You're all aware of what the time is. If speakers go over time, I have been asked by the CVF presidency and secretariat to request that you wrap up promptly in order to enable as many speakers and sharing of views to take place. Finally, we do have a question and answer segment. There is a Q&A function in this webinar. You'll be able to find that on your screens. So please do make use of the Q&A function, and post any questions that you may have. I will try to look at those from time to time, in addition to keeping time as all the other speakers speak. And when we come to the Q&A segment, I'll certainly try and pick up the questions from there. So that basically concludes the housekeeping announcements, and I hope I'm clear. If not, please post a question on the chat box, and the secretariat would be happy to clarify. Now let us move forward. We are pleased to be joined today by a very rich host of partners. And first, let me mention that the Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, Mr. Martin Chumrong, I think parliamentarians are very familiar with him. He's a familiar face. And I've also had the pleasure and privilege of working with him in the IPU. Martin, we hope this first event is the start of a longer-term relationship between the Global Organization of National Parliaments and the climate-threatened nations cooperating under the CVF banner. We will also be welcoming a keynote speech from His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who, as you all know, was the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, a very successful Secretary General, if I may say. And it is during his tenure that the Paris Agreement was signed. 2015, as we know, is the 2030 agenda starting off point, and he was an important architect in that process. And currently he's serving as the chair of the board of the Global Center on Adaptation. For those of you who are not familiar, the Global Center is a relatively young organization entirely dedicated to the challenge of adapting to climate change. The GCA is also hosting the CVF Secretariat. We are also likewise very honored and privileged to be joined by two outstanding parliamentarians, each with a very strong record of engagement and commitment in fighting climate change and tackling environmental issues with laws and parliamentary engagement in a broad spectrum of areas. Former President Nasheed of the Maldives, who is currently Speaker of the People's Majlis, that is the Parliament of the Maldives. And we also have Deputy Speaker of the Philippines, Lauren Lagarda, a longtime friend. And of course, you are also both ambassadors of the CVF for Ambition and Parliaments, respectively. We are also very pleased to be joined by Mami Mizutori, who is the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. And as we all know, the two issues, climate change adaptation and DRR, are extremely closely linked. So I thank you, all of the panelists, for joining us today. Let us move on. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, moderator, but you need to put your audio onto the English channel and mute original so that the interpreters can follow. And everybody who's following English, if they can move to the English channel and mute original audio in order to continue to hear the moderator.
Okay, am I being heard properly now? Can you hear me now? Hello? Matthew, can you hear me?
Yes, that works now.
So I don't know how much you were able to pick up, but I think I'll move on. There was the housekeeping. Did everyone pick that up, and the introduction to the panelists?
Yes, everybody would have heard it. It's just that the interpretation can't function unless you're in the English channel. Yeah. So please just proceed.
Okay, so this brings us to the focus of our session today. And if I may briefly summarize, we have a 3-4 program for this webinar. First, we would like to explore what action parliaments and parliamentarians can take to support renewed climate ambition, commitments of national governments during the remainder of the year. There are things we can do at home, and we can also reach out to partners in parliaments across the world. A year ago in Bangladesh, our national parliament declared a planetary emergency on account of the existential threat that we face today and the closing window of opportunity to keep impacts at a manageable level. Critical to this is not surpassing 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Though we now know global emissions need to be cut by 7% each year this decade if we are to keep within that very aspirational target of 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. That is why the CVF has launched the Midnight Survival Deadline for the Climate to call on all countries to meet their Paris Agreement commitments this year, to say what more they will do, because that is absolutely critical. Where we are today is simply not good enough. So raising the ambition is critical, and what they are going to do additionally to tackle climate crisis. In Bangladesh, we are aiming to pass another motion in the parliament that will, one, lend support to the national government to submit an enhanced, updated NDC before midnight of 31st December this year. Number two, we call on the parliaments of other nations to take similar actions and to ensure parliaments are not made the excuse for missing a critical once-in-a-5-year deadline under the Paris Agreement. So the 5-year deadline is 31st December 2020. And number three, to support the development of a national plan to achieve planetary prosperity through national development that is consistent with becoming climate resilient. I will share both our resolutions with the meeting outcome of today and would strongly encourage those parliaments present to consider similar actions. Secondly, with the advent of Deputy Speaker Lagarda's appointment as CVF Ambassador for Parliaments, we are exploring the possibility of launching a dedicated program. It can be a union or a league of parliaments of climate-threatened nations, and the work we could do together to better tackle climate issues. As many of us are well aware, parliaments have an extremely important role to play in fighting climate change. I think some of you may already have reviewed the concept note on what a CVF parliament can do in the meeting documents that we have already circulated. We have outlined 3 areas of work together. The first is we can share valuable experiences and good practices on legislative measures in support of ambitious and urgent climate action to safeguard communities and progress towards the CVF's goals. Number 2, we can work collectively to secure greater commitments and to overcome barriers to climate action from political parties, both within CVF member states and through international outreach. Number 3, we can work for a financing and regulatory environment to deliver the planetary prosperity agenda of the CVF. We can promote action through policy making measures, such as by creating more efficient permit and approval processes, updating building codes, enabling financing agreements, and promoting expertise, skills, and awareness. So there is really a lot that we can do, and there is a huge potential in the engagement of parliaments in this very important agenda. Thirdly, we would like to discuss the linkages between this climate agenda and the work that we do as parliamentarians to build back and forward better. This is particularly relevant to the different public stimulus and response and recovery packages being dealt with by our parliaments in these days of COVID-19. In touching on this topic, we need to express our heartfelt concern to member countries in Central America who have been devastated by hurricanes Anta and Iota, to the Philippines, who is recovering from multiple storms, including Super Typhoon Goni, the Pacific, who was hit earlier in the year by Cyclone Harold, and also in my own country of Bangladesh, which was struck by Super Cyclone Amphan just as the COVID pandemic was worsening. These types of concurrent climate-fueled crises are a serious complication to efforts to deal with a public health crisis like today's pandemic. These important topics are going to be covered. So to start us off, we are going to show a short video from the CVF Secretariat to introduce the CVF's midnight survival deadline for the climate. Can we have the video, please?
These commitments, whether for 2030 or 2050, are not aimless targets. They are life or death deadlines.
Midnight on the 31st of December 2020 is our survival deadline.
New and more ambitious NDCs this year is indeed a matter of the survival for the most vulnerable.
We call upon all parties to fulfill their commitments under it and to submit enhanced NDCs by the end of 2020.
The climate crisis is indeed an existential threat, and that every nation must treat it as such.
Action must start now, as this is the question of our survival.
We now need to redouble our efforts before we pass the point of no return.
Global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise and are now 43% higher than they were in 2000.
We must limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and transition to climate-resilient economies.
Let's aim for high ambition, zero carbon, go back to 1.5 degrees and save the planet.
We cannot possibly build back better without doing more on climate.
We have to take the leadership of making prevention of climate change effects the most important public policy that we can undertake.
Time is not on our side. Countries need to ambitiously respond to the survival deadline for the humankind.
The time to take action to save the planet is not tomorrow, but today.
2020 is the year for action.
Yes, the clock is indeed ticking, and there will be a midnight reckoning this 31st December. We are living a planetary emergency. Every action, every moment, anything we can do to save the planet counts. Our message today is not only are the vulnerable at the forefront of the drive for urgent new climate ambition, fighting for survival, and survival, as we know, means to continue to live, to exist. Hardest hit, our parliaments are also ready for this higher ambition. We are becoming organized together, and we have the plans, the tools, and the lawmaking capabilities to make a significant difference. With that, I would now like to turn to the message of His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues in the CVF Climate Vulnerable Forum, Mr. Secretary General of the IPU, Special Representative Mitch Story. As Chairman of the Global Center on Adaptation, I am pleased to share this message with you today as you convene this special first meeting of parliamentarians of climate-threatened nations. 5 years ago, the international community celebrated adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change. It is a lifeline accord. It was a beacon of hope that we can work together as one human civilization to overcome such a crisis. Today, however, I am concerned that seconds to midnight, we are far from delivering on everything the Paris Agreement represented. We can be encouraged by a number of good news recently. Major economies like Japan and my own country, Korea, committing to a carbon neutral future by 2050, and China by 2060. Moreover, Americans are rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate change by President-elect Joe Biden. But we need much stronger commitment to action in the years right ahead of us. We have to build on the commitments of members of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, who are already working to deliver on the Paris Agreement with updated NDCs this year. We need to work hard to have all countries redouble efforts, especially the well-off and major emitting nations. At COP26, some of the last guidelines on how Paris Agreement will be implemented shall be finalized. We need to accelerate in parallel a shift from international negotiation to national implementation. This is especially true for adaptation to climate change. Adaptation has not enjoyed as much priority as efforts to reduce emissions, but it could not be more vital for the communities already suffering the most severe effects of this crisis as a part of daily life. Just in the past weeks, we have seen some of the most extreme impacts affecting Central America, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and the Pacific. As parliamentarians, your role began with the ratification of the Paris Agreement on climate change. You can be the drivers of national and local action to implement this agreement. This will no doubt require changes to regulations, to public institutions and finances. Some of these changes will also help to leverage more international investment and support. You are already leading innovation in this area, and by launching this program today, I'm sure you head in the right direction. Your action is meaningful right now under the midnight survival deadline for the climate to call the world to action. And it will continue to be vital as we drive forward with the climate action in the years ahead. I look forward to hearing more about all you will achieve together. The Global Center on Adaptation will be there to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. We certainly take on board what you have said about our responsibilities and the need to lead and drive action nationally as well as locally. I would now like to turn to our other keynote speakers. First, I would like to pass to our collaborating partner, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, for your message to this, our Climate Vulnerable Focus Group of IPU members and partner countries. The IPU has started to lead programs in the areas of climate, and I'm sure that we have several potential collaboration areas moving forward. May I now invite the IPU Secretary General, Mr. Martin Chungong, to please speak.
Thank you very much, Sabeh. Great to see you again, active. I do recognize the high-level participants present at this meeting, as well as all the other participants. President Nasheed, I think I'll see you in a while. We have Mami Mizuture, very valued partner for us, the IPU, as we work together to mobilize parliaments in support of efforts to mitigate disaster risk. I therefore recognize all of you and say how pleased I am to be participating in this momentous meeting today, which marks the beginning of an initiative which I think is very noble, bringing parliaments together to discuss how they can work to address the challenges brought about by climate change, or should we say emergency, like you said, Sabeh, and as His Excellency Ban Ki-moon said a moment ago. And so, as I say, bringing together parliamentarians of the CVF countries marks an important step in strengthening the role of parliaments in implementing the Paris Agreement and addressing the climate emergency. I noticed that nearly all of the CVF member states are also members of the IPU. And this is a great opportunity to work together as a global organization encompassing everyone in order to reflect on ways to strengthen our engagement in this very critical area. Sabeh, you are honorary president of the IPU, and it is under your watch that we did adopt the Parliamentary Action Plan on Climate Change, which I think is still very relevant today. And I am very pleased to see that this is part of the resources being made available to the meeting that we are having today. So thank you very much for your leadership. I have been told time and again that climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time. Everybody has said that. And we have seen what climate change can do to undermine development gains. And so we have to tackle this emergency more robustly in the context of the devastating effects of the COVID-19 epidemic. It is a wake-up call for us because it has highlighted the fragilities that exist within our societies and our economic structures. And the people who have been hit hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic are likely to be those dealing with severe challenges created by climate change. So This emergency makes the implementation of the Paris Agreement more critical than ever. It is an international agreement, granted, but it must be supported by strong national level action to be effective. And that is where parliaments and parliamentarians have a critical role to play. I think that we have all been told about those powers that parliaments have: lawmaking, budget allocation, oversight, and accountability. All of that, we are saying they should put to good use in order to ensure that responses to climate change are both nationally appropriate and aligned with the Paris Agreement. They can allocate resources, and they must allocate resources for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And also, we want to see parliaments more robust in developing oversight of government so that there are clear provisions for enforcement and monitoring of climate-related legislation. Countries that have signed the Paris Agreement have also agreed to submit, and I think that is what you said, Sabeh, and His Excellency Ban Ki-moon said the same thing, to submit revised and enhanced nationally determined contributions by the end of 2020. The end of 2020 is just 6 weeks away, which highlights the emergency, the urgency of the situation. And we want to see parliaments today using their oversight powers to ensure that governments prepare revised NDCs and that these commitments are translated into legislation at the national level. I just want to restate the commitment of the IPU to supporting parliaments. And Sabeh, what you said about your wish for long-standing collaboration with CVF is music to my ears. We want to make sure that parliaments are at the forefront of the effort to stem the negative impact of climate change. And there is no paucity of policy resources. The IPU at the highest level has adopted a resolution on climate change, or the Paris Agreement. The recent Speakers Conference, World Conference of Speakers of Parliament, also clearly emphasized the importance of parliaments and the need for parliaments to drive transition to a climate neutral economy, to build more resilient societies, and highlight the economic and social benefits of reducing global carbon emissions. I am pleased to say that we are working also with UNDRR. Mami, you remember that there are a number of initiatives that we are taking, including a handbook on Parliament's role in addressing disasters and climate-related risks. These are resources that we think are part of our mandate to be of service to our member parliaments, and we hope that this tool will be utilized, including in the regions that are concerned today by our meeting. Of course, the Secretariat of the UNFCCC is the custodian of the Paris Agreement, and we are going to continue working with them to strengthen Parliament's ability to respond effectively to the challenges of climate change in the context of the agreement. And recently we have developed a joint policy note with the UN Environment Programme for Parliamentarians on the green economy as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me say that there's a lot that has been said. As His Excellency Ban Ki-moon has said, what we need to do now is to implement. We need to take action now and urgently, and parliaments have that role to play. We want to see more robust action by parliaments. They have to use their legislative, budgetary, and oversight, as well as representation functions to make a difference today. Parliament should seize the opportunities created through Paris to drive transformational change for a healthier planet. thing. This is very crucial, and you can be reassured, Saber and your colleagues of the climate vulnerable nations in the world, that the IPU will stand by you. The IPU is there to help address the needs of all, the small, not so small, the vulnerable, the mighty. It's a global organization. And so I am looking forward to developing cooperation so that together we can mobilize parliamentary goodwill and commitment in support of climate-friendly initiatives. Thank you very much for this opportunity to partner with you on this very important event. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Martin. And I know that the IPU, as has been the case in previous COPs, is very much focused on what is going to happen next year, COP26. And I think our initiative in trying to push for higher ambition is going to be an important stepping stone towards success of the next Conference of Parties meeting. And thank you for your solidarity. We certainly look forward to working with the IPU. I know there are many IPU events, and also the IPU Assembly is coming up in the spring. So we hope to work with you. The Green Deal that you referred to, we are looking at a planetary prosperity plan. So I'm sure we can find common ground as we move forward. Thank you very much, Martin, for your engagement with the CVF parliamentarians. May I now move on? I would like to invite former President Nasheed. He is currently, as you know, the Speaker of the Majlis, the Parliament of the Maldives. President Nasheed, you actually founded the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and you have been an outstanding advocate for climate action on the global stage. You are a UN champion of Earth. We will be very pleased to hear your thoughts on the topics of today's meeting and to hear about the plans you have for the work of the People's Majlis in these areas. Over to you, President Nasheed.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to speak with you all at this parliamentary meeting of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. In most meetings, it is heads of states who garner the most attention, but in actual fact, to my mind, it is the parliamentary representatives who do the hard work, not just of representing the people, but of scrutinizing and passing legislation. And it is what parliaments pass as legislations, more than speeches given by presidents, and I say this as a former president myself. It is legislation passed by parliaments that ultimately changes the political course of the nation. So I am hoping that as legislators, we can use this CVF Parliamentarians Forum to learn from each other and to use our skills and powers to forcefully pursue a more ambitious approach to global climate emergency. I have only got 3 minutes, so let me get straight to the point of this event. What we need to do as parliamentarians is to make sure that all legislation is in place that is necessary to get all our nations on a clean energy pathway. That means, for example, feed-in tariff taxes or tax and duty incentives to encourage clean carbon-free power sources to replace fossil fuels. It will mean power purchasing agreements for our power companies to contract for this clean power. We don't need to reinvent the wheel each time with the legal language and text needed to operationalize these things. Let us collaborate between parliaments so that we can share best laws passed to rapidly mandate the clean energy transition. And these transition plans need to be guided by a vision. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, as chair of the CVF, has encouraged us all to pursue climate prosperity plans, which would outline our targets for increasing GDP and economic growth, and at the same time as exiting fossil fuel. The Bangladesh plan is already underway, and it is termed Mujib Prosperity Plan, after her late father, the founder of the nation, Mujibur Rahman. These plans will aim to deliver the economic growth and prosperity the CVF countries rightfully demand, to eliminate poverty entirely and allow today's LDCs to reach middle income status by 2035-2040. Achieving prosperity and safe climate is not an either or, it is a both and issue. That is what climate prosperity plans will set out. There is funding available for nations who wish to embark on this process. More immediately, nations face a deadline of midnight on New Year's Eve to submit their enhanced updated NDCs under the Paris Agreement to the UNFCCC. All CVF nations are committed to achieving this deadline, but please keep the pressure on your executive and civil servants to ensure that this deadline is met. If we can pass motions in parliaments reaffirming the need to keep this deadline, that will also be very helpful. We cannot be both climate leaders and climate laggards at the same time, and in recognition of this, the CVF is running a countdown to midnight campaign to make sure all nations get their NDCs in. As Ambition Ambassador, it is my job for the CVF to take our high ambition NDCs and our climate prosperity plans to form the nucleus of a high ambition coalition that also includes the biggest and most powerful nations. Now that we can expect the United States back at the table, and that many big emitters are beginning to commit to zero carbon targets, things look more hopeful than for a long time. And I look forward to working with John Kerry, the new climate envoy for the incoming US administration. I will tell John Kerry, thanks a lot for freeing me, helping me getting out of jail, but the Maldives is still at risk. The window is closing, but it is not yet too late. We can still save Maldives and all of us in the most vulnerable category from existential risk of climate heating. But we have to act now, and it is for all of us as parliamentarians to take the lead. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, the Honorable Speaker of the People's Majlis from the Maldives. You are always very specific, you're always very practical, and thank you for inspiring us with your comments today on the way forward. May I now invite the Philippines Deputy Speaker, Lauren Regada, a very good friend of mine. Lauren, of course, has been one of the most prolific lawmakers anywhere in the world when it comes to environmental and climate issues. The Climate Change Act, the Renewable Energy Act, the Environmental Awareness Education Act, the Clean Air Act, all of these have her footprint. And I think we are very fortunate that we have her amongst us in this forum. The longstanding chair of the Senate Climate and Finance Committees, and so many other actions and initiatives that she has pioneered. You are also a UN Global Champion for Resilience, and we're really looking forward to hearing your views. Over to you, Lauren.
Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former United Nations Secretary General, fellow CVF ambassadors Mohammed Nasheed and Saber Chowdhury, IPU Secretary General Martin Chungong, fellow parliamentarians, partners. Let me state this plainly. Hard-fought development gains and productivity will continue to be undermined, or worse, reversed, if our 1.5 global warming threshold is breached. Just from October to this month, the Philippines was battered in succession by typhoons Ophel, Saudel, Molave, Super Typhoon Goni, Tropical Storm Atsani, Etau, and Typhoon Vamco. Typhoon Vamco alone has affected more than 4 million of our people. The damage to agriculture is estimated at $87 million US, while our infrastructure $181 million US, and still rising. In light of these intensifying impacts of the climate crisis, we are required to do much, much more. If countries historically responsible for the climate crisis will not act with urgency, we in the developing world must act in concert to compel them to take action, to take the lead in deep and drastic cuts in carbon emissions. There is no greater weapon to wield the righteousness of our cause than raising our own climate ambitions,
Do we have an issue
enhancing our respective nationally determined contributions is critical in demonstrating our climate leadership. Vulnerable country parliaments play a very crucial role in making this happen,
Matthew,
using our oversight, legislative, and representation functions. We must take a far more active role in helping steer our people away from the dire threats of the climate emergency. Esteemed colleagues, in the Philippines, addressing climate change has mainly been pursued by employing the political instrument of national power. We have enacted landmark laws on environment and climate change, including the Climate Change Act, the People's Survival Fund, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Education Awareness Act, Renewable Energy Law, Ecological Solid Waste Management Act, and the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act. These laws have served as our foundation for building climate resilience and have helped us close the gaps in mainstreaming climate change in our development planning processes, in advancing climate change education, and even in financing climate change adaptation and mitigation projects. I am certain we have all been equal to the task before, and I am even more sure now we will all be equal to the rough tests ahead of us. Esteemed colleagues, I am pleased to extend an invitation to all of you. Let us jointly form the CVF Parliamentary League. Let us make our collective voice louder. Such a group will more quickly enable our ability to learn from one another better, so we can all achieve our shared goals sooner. We must organize our efforts regionally using space available to us. We must influence more, and we must do what we can because we must, because we can, and because solidarity and hope are what will, in the end, prevail. I envision the CVF Parliamentary League to be a dedicated cooperation initiative of parliamentarians that will advance a common legislative agenda for integrating climate change adaptation and mitigation and disaster risk reduction in all facets of sustainable development pursuits. It will be our platform for exchanging experiences and good practices on climate action, on developing a common stand on critical climate legislation issues, and strengthening our cooperation in championing the 1.5 Paris goal. Through our shared leadership and with far greater urgency, we can hasten the transition of our countries to decarbonized development and ensure a safer, more equitable, and resilient future for our people.
Thank you, Lauren, for your excellent thoughts. We can and we must, as you say, and you also talked about forming a platform so that our voices can be brought together, and we can speak with one voice, and we may also act accordingly as representatives of the people. Thank you again, Lauren. I would now like to move on, and I now turn to the UN Secretary General Special Representative for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mizutori. She has also been working very hard with parliamentarians and also other important stakeholders. And of course, Lauren talked about the integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and the fact that we need to take an integrated approach if we are to respond effectively to climate as well as the pandemic and the recovery thereafter. We need to leverage synergies and learning across the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was also adopted in 2015. I now request the Special Representative for the Secretary General, Mizutori, to please take the floor and share her thoughts with us.
Thank you very much, Nabil. It is great to see you, albeit virtually, since the last time at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva last year. Martin, in you and in IPU, we have a very valued partner to support parliamentarians across the world. And hello to our dear friend, Lauren, President Nasheed, Excellencies, distinguished parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen. It was already apparent before the pandemic that the world was struggling to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, given the steep rise in climate-related disasters over the last 20 years. Actually, we know that 90% of the major disasters of the past 20 years were related to extreme weather events. And the eradication of poverty is impossible if we are losing a sizable percentage of GDP year after year to extreme weather events. Last year alone, 25 million people were forced from their homes by these extreme weather events. And the slow progress, unfortunately, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the inadequate level of investment in adaptation to climate change for a climate vulnerable country points to major shortcomings in the governance of disaster risk. And this is where we need parliamentarians to react on now. The underlying weakness of disaster risk governance, which was globally revealed by the failure to prepare adequately for the COVID-19 pandemic, despite many warnings and the inclusion at the insistence of member states themselves of biological hazards in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, this weakness of disaster risk governance really is the issue that we need to tackle. Moving from words to action, as many of you already have mentioned, starting with His Excellency Ban Ki-moon and Saber, moving from words to action is always a challenge, but failure to do so is too costly. The lessons learned to date from the climate emergency and the pandemic must now be applied as we strengthen both nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and also the national strategies for disaster risk reduction under the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, because as Saber has mentioned, disasters and climate emergency are so closely linked. Parliamentarians have a crucial role to play in ensuring that these plans, NDCs and national strategies for disaster risk reductions are realistic, and importantly, that resources are allocated to ensure that their implementation is supported, and they have to be supported by appropriate legislation and regulation. There is nothing stronger than law-based governance. Nationally determined contributions embody efforts by each country to reduce their national emissions and adapt to climate change, and the majority of them highlight disaster risk reduction as a priority. And similarly, adaptation to climate change is a constant thread that we are seeing in the already 93 national strategies for disaster risk reductions that member states have developed to date. Parliamentarians have an essential role to play in the national debates on the development of these instruments and ensuring that they are coherent and complementary. This requires a systemic and integrated approach to disaster risk and recognition that beyond climate change, there are a range of risk drivers which are also needed to be addressed through environmental protection, regulation of land use and building codes, and poverty reduction measures. As Martin has already mentioned, this approach will be reflected in the new Parliamentarian Toolkit for Disaster Risk Reduction, which my organization, UNDRR, is developing with IPU. And this toolkit, this handbook, will be launched early next year. We look forward to working with you so that these toolkits, these guidances, will be transformed into action and ensure that we can both make progress at national, local level, and the community levels. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mami, for making those important points. And well, one statistic, in fact, that stands out is that 90% of the disasters today are driven by climate. They're climate related. So the coherence, the complementarity, the convergence between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction is going to be very important. Thank you so very much for your contribution and also for your solidarity in working with the CVF member countries. Now, moving on from our panelists today, we have a number of distinguished parliamentary representatives from some of the CVF members who have asked to be able to share their views ahead of the broader discussion. I've kept an eye on the Q&A. There are already a number of questions. We will try and get to them as soon as we hear the statements that we will now have shortly. So let me first offer the floor to Honorable Edgar M. Chato, who is in fact the Committee Secretary on the Committee on Climate Change of the Philippines. Mr. Chato, would be grateful if you can keep your remark to 2 to 2.5 minutes. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. To all distinguished participants of this high-level Climate Vulnerable Forum, good day. Before I introduce the Speaker of the Philippine House of Representatives, let me share with you that our Department of Energy's recent announcement on the moratorium on new coal sends a decisive signal to domestic and foreign investors financing renewable energy. The House Committee on Climate Change, under my leadership, is in full support of this promotion of sustainable and renewable energy. In fact, the House resolution on environmental and climate emergency calling on the major carbon emitters, local industries, and local government units to pursue renewable and sustainable energy sources was adopted by the House of Representatives today at 7:02 p.m. This is the first climate emergency declaration that is national in scope in the country. Our next speaker is the youngest to have been elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Philippines since the country became a republic. A lawyer by profession, he has also served in the other two branches of government, in the judiciary as a lawyer, in the Supreme Court, and in the executive branch as provincial administrator of the province of Marinduque. As legislator, he has always been a leading advocate of environmental protection and sustainability, and has consistently pushed for sustainable and adequate energy for Filipinos and effective and good governance. He has also been fighting for disaster management and climate change mitigation, and has proposed the establishment of a Department of Disaster Resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow parliamentarians, the Honorable Speaker of the Republic of the Philippines, Lord Alan J. Q. Velasco.
Excellencies, the parliamentarians of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Goni, the world's strongest storm this year, killed at least 22 people in the Philippines, while forcing about 1 million more to evacuate. Goni came a few days after Typhoon Molave, which left at least 16 dead and causing a minimum of 2.66 billion pesos or 54 million US dollars of damage to crops. On November 13, a few days after Goni, Typhoon Vamco hit our country, the 21st typhoon to hit the Philippines this year. Typhoon Vamco caused massive flooding in the northern parts of the country, displacing hundreds of thousands of people and causing about 3.84 billion pesos or 79 million US dollars damage to agriculture. Previously, the record for the world's strongest landfalling tropical cyclone in history was held by super typhoons Meranti and Haiyan, which hit the Philippines in 2016 and 2013 respectively. In the midst of a global pandemic, these typhoons and floods have forced our people to stay in cramped evacuation centers where there is higher risk of transmission of the virus. In the midst of this pandemic, our people are going wet, cold, and hungry. Excellencies, we are your people. Our local emergencies are your global emergencies. The increasingly violent typhoons, hurricanes, and floods caused by climate change are becoming the new normal all over the world, and the Philippines has been at the unfortunate receiving end of the worst of them. As parliamentarians of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, we need to set enabling policies that will accelerate our transition to low carbon and climate resilient economies, notwithstanding the COVID-19 pandemic. In the Philippines, the House of Representatives, with the help of the House Committee on Climate Change, maintains close coordination with the Office of the President and the Climate Change Commission to address gaps in climate actions and the implementation of our climate change laws and policies. When the Philippines ratified the Paris Agreement, the government set forth a country-defined timeline to submit the first nationally determined contribution before 2020. The instrument of accession signed by President Duterte was accompanied by a declaration of state that the accession to and implementation of the Paris Agreement by the Republic of the Philippines is for the purpose of supporting the country's national development objectives and priorities, which include sustainable industrial development, eradication of poverty and provision of basic needs, securing social and climate justice, and energy security. The Philippine nationally determined contributions we have set shows the world our resolve to pursue low-carbon development as well as the support we need from developed countries in terms of climate finance, capacity building, and technology transfer in the context of climate justice and in accordance with the Paris Agreement. Excellencies, the need for climate action is as urgent as the need for a vaccine for COVID-19. To this end, I look forward to working with the parliamentarians of the Climate Vulnerable Forum in developing a common legislative agenda that will ensure a world united in pursuing sustainable practices which would significantly abate the effects of climate change, particularly in vulnerable areas in the world. Together, let us deliver on the much-needed policies that will usher a new era of economic development that is founded on sustainability, environmental protection, better risk governance, and climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to the Honorable Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Philippines, and also to you, Mr. Chato, for your important messages and for sharing those with us. I would now like to invite our next speaker, who is the Honorable Dr. Bimala Rai Padwal of the National Assembly of Nepal. And after that, I will call on Bhutan. I think we have a pre-recorded message from Dr. Padwal in Nepal. You may play that now, please.
Respected Chairperson, distinguished panelists and delegates, fellow parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen. At the onset, I congratulate government of Bangladesh and people of Bangladesh for taking leadership of Climate Vulnerable Forum and for timely organizing this global parliamentarians meeting. I am delighted to represent Federal Parliament of Nepal in this August event. Today, combined effect of COVID-19 pandemic and climate change have challenged the entire humanity. Mountainous countries like Nepal and coastal countries like Bangladesh are most affected due to both crises. The poor and marginalized people across the globe, particularly women, children, senior citizens, and indigenous nationalities are bearing the disproportionate cost of it, resulting into acute health issues, food insecurity, and poverty. There is no choice, Your Excellencies, except to join our hands and minds together with higher degree of confidence and commitment to address these issues. In this regard, this global parliamentarian meeting is very, very important. Nepal is committed to implement Paris Agreement together with international communities. We have developed climate change policy dedicated to decrease the climate vulnerability and increase the economic resilience through the implementation of national and local action plans for adaptation. Contributions to global carbon emissions. Nepal government is preparing enhanced NDC with ambition in targets and actions. Your Excellencies, lawmaking, oversight of government's work, and representing people's voice are important role of to focus on sustainable development, environment, and climate change agenda. The Parliamentary Committee of National Assembly has established SDG Resource Center and has developed a checklist to help MPs mainstream environment and climate change agenda in their work. This is expected to increase MPs' performance in mainstreaming climate change agenda. Your Excellencies, we have witnessed that increasing severity and magnitude of climate extremes threaten food and water security and agricultural income of billions. Transformative technologies are needed to increase adaptation and resilience in our parts of the world that are facing the brunt of the climate. It is high time that parliamentarians facing the brunt of the climate, it is high time that the parliamentarians' voice at national, regional, and global level to develop transformative technologies with innovative financing mechanism to address climate change and ensure that the most vulnerable countries have access to such emerging and affordable technologies. COVID-19 pandemic has altered the economic and social behavior of our society. There is increasing realization that pandemic and climate change may result in unprecedented disruptions, and we must seek opportunities for low carbon systems and green growth potentials. I believe that parliamentarians have important roles to ensure that government's policies, regulations, and work nurture and guide activities towards these potentials. Being people's representative, it is equally important that we motivate consumers' behavior to adopt a green lifestyle and ultimately towards promoting green economy. Your Excellencies, women are important actors and active agents in mitigation and adaptation to climate change, but often neglected, especially in resource allocation. Nepal has adopted gender-responsive budgeting since past 2 decades with increased direct spending on women. With this learning, I would like to take this opportunity to urge all parties and delegates to apply gender-responsive budgeting system in all aspects of climate change mitigations and adaptations work to ensure gender justice and for more effective response to climate crisis. Finally, I thank you for this opportunity to share my aspirations in front of you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Padwal, and it's important to hear the perspectives from Nepal. We will now move on to neighboring Bhutan, and I'm very pleased to call upon the Honorable Member of Parliament and Committee Chair from Bhutan, Honorable Dasho Kien Siring, and after that I will call on Yemen, May I just draw the attention of our distinguished panelists to the questions that have appeared on the Q&A section. If you could please have a look at those, we would like to take a few of those questions. As soon as we finish with the interventions, we will move on to the Q&A. I now call upon the Honorable Member from Bhutan to speak, please. You need to, I think, unmute yourself. Honorable Searing. Can someone from the Secretariat assist, please? Okay, I think there might be some technical issues. Let me move on and I'll come back to Bhutan if that's going to be possible later on. I would now like to invite Dr. Ali Al-Zanem, is Chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Expatriates Committee of the Parliament of Yemen. And after that, I'll call upon Bangladesh. Dr. Al-Zanem, you have 2.5 minutes, please. You have the floor, sir. Can you please unmute yourself?
Sorry.
Is the Honorable Member of Parliament from Bangladesh ready? Mr. Searing, I can see you. Would you like to speak?
Yes,
from
please.
Bhutan?
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you, moderator. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I'm not receiving his audio. Can the Secretariat help?
Can you hear me, please? Can you hear me?
Can we hear him? Okay.
In the system, he's unmuted.
Okay, go ahead. We can hear.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Saber Chowdhury, for the opportunity. Excellencies, honorable participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to represent the Royal Government of Bhutan in the Global Parliamentarian Meeting organized by the CVF in collaboration with the IPU and the Global Center on Adaptation. It is my pleasure to inform that Bhutan has been a vanguard of environmental conservation despite being a least developed country, most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Further, Bhutan declared to remain carbon neutral at the 15th conference of the parties to the UNFCCC held in Copenhagen in 2009. This commitment was further reaffirmed through the submission of our nationally determined contributions in 2015. Let me also take the opportunity to share that our second nationally determined contribution, NDC, is progressive and ambitious in target and is geared towards contributing to the global goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Environmental conservation is recognized as a key determinant towards achieving our developmental goals of gross national happiness, which focuses on sustainable and equitable socio-economic development. In recognition of the importance of environmental conservation, and the multiple threats of climate change, the Parliament of the Kingdom of Bhutan has formed a dedicated committee titled Environment and Climate Change Committee. The committee provides the required impetus to ensure matters related to climate change are given due consideration and deliberation at the parliamentary sessions. We recognize the amplified set of challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on our efforts to address climate change. Notwithstanding the challenges, the Royal Government is determined to ensure that our response and recovery to COVID-19 pandemic is inclusive of measures to mitigate climate change?
Honorable Hearing, can I just make a request? I think you have chosen the main audio. You should pick one channel and not the main audio, because if you do that, then the interpretation is not possible. Can you pick one channel, please? One channel, please, not the main audio. And can the others also please keep this in mind? So the main audio channel, you should not be there, but please choose any other. That should be muted. Okay, central audio to be muted so that the interpreters can follow. Please continue, and then I will, after you finish, I will call upon the next speaker.
Start video. Is it okay? Is it better now? Is it better now? Can you get me better now? Is it better now? Can you, is it better now?
Perhaps, Honorable Hearing, I seek your understanding if I may move to the next speaker, because we are very short on time, and I will try and come back to you later if it is possible. May I now invite the Honorable Dr. Ali Al-Zanem from the Parliament of Yemen. Can you please pick one channel and mute the main audio and speak, please, within 2.5 minutes? You have the floor, sir.
أهلا وسهلا، شكرا كثيرا. نحن السيدة والسادات، نحن في الجمهورية اليمنية من خلال مشاركة البرلمان اليمني في هذه الندوة أو غيرها من الندوات والمؤتمرات ذات الصلة بالمناخ وتغيراتها والمعالجات التي ينبغي القيام بها من قبل البرلمانات والحكومات في مختلف دول العالم.
Do you hear him? Do you hear Mr. Dr. Zanem?
Yes, we can hear the audio of the doctor, and I assume that you will translate into English for the participants.
Okay, we will translate.
فإننا نبدي موافقتنا على كل الإجراءات الإيجابية التي تصب بمصلحة البشرية جمعاء وبما يعزز من الالتزام باتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن المناخ في باريس وغيرها، وإن كان هناك من الدول التي تسمى عظمى وهي تتلاعب بهذا الملف العالمي تارة وتشارك تارة أخرى تعلن الانسحاب من اتفاقية باريس كالإدارة الأمريكية. ونبدي هنا.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are in the Republic of Yemen, and through the participation of the Yemeni Parliament in this webinar, of other webinars and conferences related to climate change and other treatments that should be undertaken by Parliament and the government in various countries of the world, we express our agreement on all positive measures that are in the interest of all mankind and the way to enhance commitment to the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate in Paris and other agreements.
ونبدي هنا تفاعلنا الكبير في قضايا المناخ واستعداد الجمهورية اليمنية لتفعيل العمل البرلماني والتشريعي بالتنسيق مع الحكومة باتخاذ خطوات عملية لتحقيق أهداف اتفاقية باريس أو غيرها. إلا أننا نتساءل عبر هذه الندوة العالمية والأمانة العامة للبرلمان الدولي وكل دول العالم الحر المشاركة في هذه الندوة، أين أنتم من الحرب المنسية في اليمن 6 سنوات من العدوان الغاشم الذي يشن على وطننا وتدمير كل شيء له علاقة بحياة الإنسان اليمني ومن يعيشون على أرضه من المهاجرين واللاجئين الذين يتدفقون يوميا بالآلاف على بلد يعاني ما يعانيه وخلقوا أكبر معاناة إنسانية شهدتها البشرية.
However, we direct question through this global webinar to the General Secretariat of the International Parliament and all other liberal countries of the world participating in this webinar. Where are you from the forgotten war in Yemen? It has been 6 years of brutal aggression waged on the homeland and destruction of everything related to lives in Yemen, the Yemeni people, and the immigrants and refugees who live in our land, thousands of whom flock to Yemeni daily, adding to the suffering of any already on an already suffering country, which has created the worst humanitarian suffering ever.
السادة المشاركون في الندوة.
Zanem, if I may, Dr. Zanem, the situation in Yemen is tragic. I know it. The IPU Secretary General is aware of it. It is completely unacceptable. But if you would please focus on the climate issue and finish your statement within the next 1 minute. Anything else that you said, we'll try to include it in the records. But please focus on climate, and within the next 1 minute, if you would kindly wrap up. Thank you.
Okay.
طيب، سأعمل لجنة النواب في الجمهورية اليمنية وأسعى لسن القوانين التي تهتم بالبيئة وتأثيرات المناخ أو أي تغييرات طبيعية تؤثر على البيئة. وفيما يخص اتفاق باريس وكل الاتفاقيات الدولية ذات الصلة، فدستور اليمن يؤكد في المادة 6 تؤكد الدولة العمل بميثاق الأمم المتحدة والإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان وميثاق جامعة الدول العربية وقواعد القانون الدولي المعترف بها بصورة عامة.
Okay, can you interpret if you can just wrap it up, please? And
Yes.
The full statement that honorable member has will be included in the record. So after your interpretation, we will move to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Dr. Zanem.
Okay. The Yemeni Parliament has endorsed and intact the laws for the environment. Like, for example, in the Constitution, we have 3 major articles which are tackling the climate change, and also there is relevant laws reflecting the Constitution were issued, including one in 1995, one in 2004 for protection of marine environmental pollution. And the paper of Mr. Zanem is with you. The speech is with you. If you want to go through it, please go ahead. And also, Dr. Zanem has been asking 4 questions in the discussion panel.
Yes.
And just to keep it, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your understanding, Dr. Zanem. And we will record the text in our records. Can I quickly check if Bhutan is ready? If Honorable Searing is now able to speak with the right audio channel? Honorable Searing from Bhutan?
Yes, I'm ready. Fortunately, I can hear Your Excellencies very well, except that I couldn't get through it.
I'm sorry, we seem to have the same issue. I'm sorry, we are having the same issue. Have you selected one channel? Have you muted the main audio channel?
Yes, I have done whatever is possible at my end.
The Secretariat, can you hear him? Because I'm not able to pick up.
I would suggest we just allow to conclude his statement on the main audio channel because I think he only has 1 or 2 minutes left, and then we can resume interpretation.
Honorable Searing, if you wouldn't mind, just wrap up your comments within the next 30 seconds, please. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. As the Paris Agreement moves on into post-2020 implementation, harnessing the levels of both national implementation and global decision-making will be important to build back better from COVID-19 and put the world on track to 1.0 world. Bhutan would like to call for robust, ambitious, and promising climate actions from all the parties. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will try and include your speech in the records, the outcome documents, and thank you. Thank you for your understanding. May I quickly move on to Honorable Kazi Nabil Ahmed. He's a young member of Parliament from Bangladesh, my own country, and if he would like to share his thoughts very briefly. You have the floor, Honorable Member of Parliament from Bangladesh. Matthew, is he available? Okay, I'm going to move on because time is very short. Before we move on to Q&A session and segment, I would like to invite the representative of the UNFCCC Secretariat, Director Yusuf Nassef, who is the head of the Adaptation Department. Mr. Nassef, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, distinguished dignitaries, honorable members of Parliament, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. There's no doubt that the current global health crisis has lent us a new perspective in approaching both international and national policymaking, and in particular for global risks and hazards such as COVID-19, but also for climate change, the planetary emergency towards which we are counting down rapidly, all the way to midnight. Before COVID-19, we knew that meeting the 1.5 degree goal to avoid the worst consequences of climate change required transformation at a radically greater pace and scale. Business as usual was already not an option. Now, with the crisis laying bare the vulnerabilities of societies, concerted action is all the more essential. Now, the major recovery effort needed in the wake of COVID-19 offers an opportunity to reorient our regulatory environments, our policies, and our plans in such a way as to build resilience, not only to climate change, but also many other major challenges facing humanity that are on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, many of you know that nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, are a cornerstone of national pledges for climate ambition. In the coming period, many revised or new NDCs and long-term low-emission development strategies, which we call LTSs, must be enabled and submitted. Based on these submissions, the UNFCCC Secretariat will prepare a synthesis report, which will hopefully demonstrate a positive global transition towards the low-carbon future we aspire to. Now, we are mandated to produce a synthesis report for all NDCs submitted in 2020, and therefore it is imperative that as many countries as possible submit their new or revised NDCs by the end of next month, the 31st of December 2020, in order to be considered in this synthesis. This is a major crux of responding to the midnight survival target. National legislation is obviously an important complement to international policymaking, and the Grantham Institute reports that since 1997, the number of climate change laws and policies has doubled every 4 to 5 years. Roughly half of the legislation has been passed by the legislative branch and half by the executive branch. We're also noticing that as the number of climate laws rose, the pace of new legislation is leveling off. And also that while national laws that promote climate action have been increasing steadily, they are yet insufficient to help reach the desired level of decarbonization enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, ambition is not only about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it is also focused on adaptation, on helping communities adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. To this end, the International Committee has adopted also a mechanism known as National Adaptation Plans, or NAPs. The NAP guidelines mention that such planning efforts would benefit tremendously from a legal mandate for each country at national level in order to ensure rigor, seriousness, and holistic coverage across all sectors. And we are hopeful that a large group of countries will have submitted their NAPs by COP26 at the end of next year. Ladies and gentlemen, the Climate Vulnerable Forum has consistently called for the highest possible climate ambition in line with the Paris goals. At the same time, parliamentarians are well poised to embody this ambition into appropriate laws and regulations that can lock countries into long-term sustainability. The UNFCCC is committed to engaging parliamentarians and has recently entered into an MOU with IPU to this effect. Finally, through an agenda that centers around planetary climate prosperity, we can together ensure that efforts to address climate change and other developmental and environmental concerns proceed with a steady pace. As mentioned in the flyer for this event, parliamentarians are in a unique position to support delivery of climate change commitments by the executive branch, and these must be centered around enhanced pledges in NDCs, as well as effective NAPs to address vulnerability. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nassef. You referred to the synthesis report, which I think is going to be very important. And I see that Martin is still here. I know there is a spring assembly of the IPU that we have every year. So I think that is going to be a very important document in terms of building up and laying the benchmark for COP26 and what action needs to be taken. You also talked about the prosperity plans and how the development agenda can be aligned with the action that we take on climate change, and especially in context of the pandemic. So I think that's good. What I would like to do, thank you again, Mr. Nassef. What I would like to do is move rapidly to the Q&A segment, and the distinguished panelists are there. There are a number of questions that are in the Q&A section. May I first move to President Nasheed, the Honorable Speaker, and see whether he would like to pick up on a few of the points there and just speak very briefly and address them.
Chaudhry, one of the questions I saw was how, after a few points, how can governments be persuaded to stick to the Paris principles and the Paris Accord? We feel that the best way that we could do that is to see the prosperity plans pursued by governments. We also feel that once it becomes an economic issue, then it is very likely that these problems be solved through market mechanisms and through organized and planned manners. But most importantly, we feel that to persuade governments, the governments must be able to see the issue as a win-win issue. Now, governments are persuaded when people are persuaded, when the governments act when they think and when they feel that they are going to lose popularity. Now, usually they do that. So once this becomes an economically viable and financially feasible issue, then I feel that governments are very likely to pursue this. It is already such an issue. In any given situation, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuel. So if parliaments, as I mentioned before, if parliaments can come up with feed-in tariff systems, power purchasing agreements, and all sorts of other procurement procedures for governments that would allow governments to procure renewable energy, or that would allow producers of renewable energy to produce it and distribute it. So we need the legislations, we need the frameworks. The economics is already there, and the science is very certain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Speaker from the Maldives. Loren, if I may go to you next, and I also see that Mami is with us as well as Martin. If you could also have a quick look at the Q&A and pick up any questions that you would like to respond to. Loren, may I go to you now?
Yes, thank you very much, Saber. Yes, there is a query on how it could be more in-depth into the CVF Parliamentary League, which I suggested earlier. Well, we could actually strengthen the CVF more as a South-South cooperation platform among countries by forming a parliamentary league. I envision that this league could push for a common legislative agenda, as well as serving as a knowledge-sharing platform on good legislative experiences and practices on climate action among all the CVF member states. And as we champion the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate goal at the global level, we should also enact policies and measures among our representation, our different districts, in our own national legislative agenda that can help accelerate adaptation as well. And within the CVF, we must show that based on our own experience, good laws and policies could breed good results and outcomes of our countries. So best practices among, let's say, the Maldives, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Nepal, and all the other 48 CVF countries is very, very important. I would also like to, there was this message here on some examples of Philippine legislation that can be shared with other CVF countries. I would be most happy to share all the legislative initiatives, laws actually, that I've enacted from 1998, which Saber so kindly mentioned, most especially the Climate Change Act, which created the Commission on Climate Change, which mainstreams not only climate change adaptation and mitigation, but also disaster risk reduction. That's why we work closely with the UN DRR of MAMI, as she mentioned earlier. And we also enacted an amendatory law to this, which is the People Survival Fund, which is similar to an adaptation fund. But this is for local governments, for mayors and governors who cannot access international funding, but it is annually appropriated through the national budget, and we parliamentarians have the power of the purse by creating this PSF fund. It is an adaptation fund, and so far 6 municipalities, these are local government units in the Philippines, have accessed this PSF. And if I may say, this is a very new law. It was previously unfunded, but well, thanks, when I became chairman of the Committee on Finance, we were able to fund it, although very small, just 1 billion pesos. But there could be other countries that can have bigger budgets for the PSF. And this really would help local governments in their local adaptation practices. I could go on, but I don't want to speak too much. I am certain that the others, if I may just mention as well, we also enacted the expanded national integrated protected areas. It is so important to legislate the protection and conservation of both bridge to reef, of both marine and terrestrial, the protection by mangroves, the protection by planting more trees. And despite all these laws, Typhoon Vamco still happened. I believe that the representative of the province of Cagayan, one of the most hard hit by Typhoon Vamco, is also online with us today, along with my passionate statements now, Saber and President Rashid and all of us present here. I share my grief and I share my love to the people of Cagayan and Isabela who have been inflicted with so much damage and death. And so what I'm saying is that we parliamentarians can enact the laws. We can even fund it through the power of the purse, but our oversight function on the executive departments implementing the legislation that we have done, that is the most important matter. And I think as a parliamentary league, if we organize ourselves as such, we could have a louder voice that can really push urgent climate action for 1.5 degrees globally. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. Mami, is there a question that you wanted to take in particular, or Martin? There are a number of questions. One was on indicators for vulnerability. You know, how do you assess what are the danger levels? Although the question was put in context of climate change, whether there's anything you can say in terms of disasters. And Martin, any responses from you to any of the questions very quickly? We're already over time.
Okay. Saber, can you hear me?
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
On the question of indicators, indeed, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction has 38 indicators to which the member states submit data to our organization. They're about mortality, missing people, people affected in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of the economic loss, but not the absolute figure, but in comparison to their GDP, damage to infrastructure, disruption of service. These indicators will definitely show how vulnerable you are against disasters and, as you have said, much to do with climate emergency. One more quick point is that another way to look into what can you do, because the question also said, what can you do in terms of measures? I think it's important to learn from other countries which have similar kinds of recurrent hazards. So I mentioned the example of your country, Saber, because Bangladesh in 1970, when a cyclone hit, you lost 1 million people. But then after that, you put on early warning systems, shelters, which could also shelter not only people, but their livestock. And last year, when you had a similar strong cyclone, you lost people, but it was 19 people. So there are many best practices out there, and I think it's important to learn from there. Over to you, Saber.
Thank you, Mami. And if I may just mention for the reference of parliamentarians, the Sendai framework of action specifically refers to the important role that parliamentarians have to play in terms of strengthening the legislative framework. So I think, this particular document, I think, is something that parliamentarians should certainly look at. Martin, if I may very quickly move to you, is there any question that you wanted to pick up from the Q&A?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I saw a question coming from Nasrin Kami Castro regarding the role of international organizations in particular.
Right.
Let me, as a representative of the international organizations, I think that there is a critical role we can play. And for instance, the meeting that we have today is part and parcel of action that international organizations can take. That is forging alliances across countries between parliamentarians that are of like mind on an issue such as the climate emergency. This is very important. Advocacy and awareness raising is what we can do. And to speak for the IPU, we see our role as bringing together policymakers with those who have the expertise and data that can help inform policy, that can help inform parliamentary action, whether it's oversight or budgetary allocations. In many jurisdictions, parliamentarians are not aware of what is happening. I'm sure you ask the question, what is the Paris Agreement? Very few parliamentarians will tell you, except those who are very much engaged in the subject matter. But our ambition is to make sure that this is something that is parliament-wide. It's not limited to just a few individuals who are champions of the issue. Then the other point that I want to make is that of capacity building. Making sure that parliaments have the right information, they have the right knowledge of the issues and what they are called upon to take action on. Then, of course, we have the tools. And Mami, you mentioned the handbook that we are developing on disaster risk reduction. It's one of the tools that are out there, that will be out there. It's important that we use the international mechanisms to forge partnerships that cut across silos. You have parliaments, you have international organizations, but also those entities that have the expert knowledge, including in the private sector, including in the civil society, bringing this together for the benefit of parliamentary action that can ensure effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I think the point that I would like to make as someone who is very close to the IPU is that we are talking about parliamentarians in the most vulnerable countries. But at the end of the day, each country is vulnerable. If something happens to the Maldives, the Maldives is the first. It's going to happen to the other countries of the world. So at the end of the day, all countries are vulnerable. And maybe in terms of sequence, the countries most at risk are going to suffer the most. But I think the point to be made is that every country is vulnerable. And in fact, it's a question of survival. And when it is that, it doesn't pick countries, it's going to happen across the board. Thank you very much for those questions that we have had from the various participants and also to our distinguished panelists for answering them. We will try to accommodate the questions that have not been answered in the final outcome document. And I think the Secretariat can take note of that and maybe seek answers from the panelists themselves. We are in fact well over time, but I would like to move very quickly. As you were all speaking, I was trying to make some notes in terms of what would be the conclusion for this very important first meeting of parliamentarians of the climate vulnerable countries. So I would like to summarize a few of the key points that have emerged from the discussions. First, I think we do have options when we do have a role to play in terms of parliamentary action, even during the remainder of this 1 year. Martin pointed out that it's only weeks to go, but as we say, even a week is a long time in politics. So let's make use of the time that we have in hand. We can pass resolutions, we can adopt the motion that we talked about, and we have heard from our CVF parliamentary champions in that regard. We can also call on our partner governments around the world to be part of the effort to take greater action during the remainder of the weeks in 2020 and well before December 31st. Secondly, I think we have a lot to learn and share with each other as we push towards tackling this climate crisis from the very front lines, because we really are at the front line of climate change. We are eager and ready to work with one another. I think there's a lot of solidarity, there's a lot of goodwill. And so we should begin work on developing a CVF Parliaments group or union or league, whatever we call it, that can be launched, I think, next year. I think this is an excellent suggestion and we should certainly work on that. Thirdly, as we start to work together more intensively as parliaments, sharing experiences, practices, and expertise to move faster, we can aspire to achieve planetary or climate prosperity. I think this point is very important. We all know that climate change is an existential crisis, but out of that crisis, out of the challenge comes opportunities. And I think we as parliamentarians can certainly look at the positives of what is otherwise a very dismal situation. So I think the prosperity plan is something that we look at. How can we be more resilient? How can we be less disaster prone? How can we improve on governance? How we can mitigate risk? We want to grow jobs. We want to provide employment, especially for our young populations. We want to acquire new and cutting edge technology. We want to secure investment. And we want to usher in a brave new world, which is what the SDG is about, transforming where we are today and where we want to go to in the future. Fourthly, I think the role of parliamentarians is particularly vital at this time of special intervention of governments into society in terms of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our economies and communities are in chaos. Many have been devastated, especially in the climate vulnerable nations. We have been experiencing incredible concurrent impacts and disasters. So it's not just one, it's a multitude of disasters all happening at the same time. So we have to work carefully through this period, taking the opportunity that extraordinary government measures keep us moving forward in the right direction to reduce future risks of different kinds, public health, climate, and otherwise. Finally, I think we have shared principles for locally led adaptation action. This is one of the most urgent policy areas for the CVF. I think it is clear that as parliaments, we are about representation of our communities. The representation aspect is very important in public laws, in regulations, and responses that will come to affect the constituents that we represent. Likewise, we are about action within the communities that we represent and about ensuring our constituencies are effectively supported. I therefore encourage you to look into all of these principles and to consider them as CVF principles for helping to drive efforts to protect our communities from climate consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow parliamentarians, in closing, I would like to thank all of our partners, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the Global Center on Adaptation, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and our fellow CVF parliaments and parliamentarians around the world. SDG Goal 17 is about partnerships, not just locally, but also locally, nationally, and regionally, and amongst institutions. We will be sharing the outcome of the meeting shortly with all of the participants. Now, before closing the meeting, I have one last segment to cover, and this is a pleasant surprise. We have received a message from the President of the Senate of the Philippines. I would like to request that we hear this message. It's a very short message, about 2 minutes prior to closing this meeting. So can we please have the message on?
Excellencies, fellow parliamentarians of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Senate of the Philippines, I would like to convey our grateful appreciation to the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and the Global Center on Adaptation for championing the critical work of parliaments in advancing climate change and sustainable development. We clearly recognize that the best available science mandates us to build the resilience of our communities in order to face the worsening impacts of climate change, as well as pursue a green economic development. In the Philippines, the legislators have continuously addressed the prevailing as well as emerging disaster and climate risks by instituting the necessary policy framework through the enactment of crucial laws, just like the Clean Air Act, the Renewable Energy Act, the Climate Change Act, and Green Jobs Act, just to name a few, most of which were championed in the Senate by a former colleague and one of your own leaders at the CVF, the Honorable Loren Legarda. Excellencies, enabling our people not only to survive but prosper in this era of climate change and pandemics is a moral imperative. We may be vulnerable. Our nations may be at most risk. But together, we can be a powerful force that could drive the global transformation that we seek for a safer, healthier, and more sustainable future. Thank you and congratulations once more for the successful conduct of this inaugural global meeting of parliamentarians of the Climate Vulnerable Forum.
Thank you to the President of the Senate of the Philippines. Well, we have almost come to the end of the session. Let me just say what a pleasure and a privilege it has been for me to act as a moderator of this very important first meeting. I think this could well be a defining partnership that we are putting in place. So thanks to all of you. And I think the words of the President of the Senate of the Philippines is a very appropriate way to end this event. Last but not least, I should thank Matthew and his team at the CVF Secretariat. I think they've been outstanding in terms of support. We only had a short time to put this event together. There might have been some technical issues, but I think this is expected. This is the downside of technology. Sometimes you're not able to have it play out as we would like it to. And also thanks to the interpreters. This has been a new experience for us at the CVF in trying to cover a spectrum of languages. But this is a reality because this is a global meeting. And CVF is also quite global in terms of the geographic membership that we have. So from me, I would like to end this meeting for today. Thank you again, all of you. Please stay well, stay safe, and do take care of yourselves.